An army is approaching from the east, so enormous that, according to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, its numbers reached millions, although modern estimates tend towards 200,000-300,000 people. This is not just an invasion, it is a force ready to wipe an entire civilization off the face of the earth. Why was it Xerxes, the Persian king, who instilled in the Greeks a fear comparable to the horror of the apocalypse? Today, we will examine how his unyielding will, cruelty, and large-scale projects made him a symbol of absolute threat. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let's get started. Xerxes, son of Darius, inherited not only the throne, but also his father's unfinished business, the conquest of Greece. However, his approach was different. He did not intend to carry out a local punitive operation. He intended to crush Hellas with the full might of his empire, and to this end he assembled an army that still amazes the imagination. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, often referred to as the father of history, cites staggering figures. He meticulously lists the contingents from all the satrapies, from Persians in tiaras and Indians in cotton clothes to Ethiopians clad in leopard skins. According to his calculations, the land army numbered 1,700,000 soldiers, and together with the fleet and auxiliary units, the total number reached 5 million people. Modern historians, of course, are skeptical about these figures, considering them hyperbole designed to emphasize the greatness of the Greek victory. More realistic estimates, based on the logistical capabilities of the time, suggest an army of 200,000 to 300,000 men and a fleet of more than 1,000 ships. But even these more modest figures were unimaginable for the Greeks. The movement of such a mass of people was not just a military maneuver, but a natural disaster. When the vanguard of Xerxes' army entered a city, its rear guard had not even left its previous camp. This living stream stretched for tens of kilometers. This feeling of overwhelming mass was a key element of psychological warfare. Xerxes was not just leading soldiers, he was leading all of Asia, demonstrating that it was not just a king who was against him, but the whole world, alien and incomprehensible to the Greeks. Conquering the elements and engineering wonders. However, it was not only the sheer numbers that caused fear. The Greeks, whose lives were inextricably linked to the will of the gods and the whims of nature, were confronted by a man who openly defied both. Xerxes' will was absolute, and he recognized no barriers, neither human, divine, nor natural. The most striking example of this was the crossing of the Hellespont, now the Dardanelles Strait. To transport his gigantic army from Asia to Europe, Xerxes ordered the construction of 2 grandiose pontoon bridges made of interconnected ships. When the first structure was almost complete, a violent storm broke out and destroyed it. The king's reaction was not simply the anger of a ruler, but an act that the Greeks perceived as madness and blasphemy. He ordered his executioners to punish the sea. The waters of the Hellespont were lashed with 300 blows of the whip, and red-hot shackles were thrown into the waves. At the same time, heralds shouted, "O bitter moisture, thus our Lord punishes you for the insult you have inflicted on him, even though he has done you no harm." This symbolic act demonstrated that Xerxes considered himself above the elements themselves, that he could subjugate even the sea. But his engineering feats did not end there. Perivius' fleet under the command of Mardonius was lost off Cape Athos in a violent storm. To avoid a repeat of this disaster, Xerxes ordered a canal to be dug right through the Athos Isthmus. Over a course of 3 years, thousands of workers took turns digging a canal about 2.5 kilometers long and wide enough for 2 triremes warships to pass through at the same time.
It was a colossal structure for its time, comparable in a scale to modern megaprojects. The Greeks who watched this saw not just military cunning, but further proof that nothing was impossible for this king. He was ready to literally redraw the map of the world to achieve his goal. What if a farmer from Thrace who had spent his entire life looking at an immovable mountain cape and then saw enemy ships sailing across it as if it were a river? It was a sight that shattered his familiar view of the world order. For the Greeks, who believed that hubris, pride and defiance of the gods was always punished, Xerxes was the living embodiment of this mortal sin. And they waited in horror for the gods to unleash their wrath upon him, fearing at the same time to be too close to the epicenter of that wrath. He was not just a conqueror, but a man who seemed to have decided to challenge Poseidon for power over the seas and Gaia for the shape of the land. What if he won that challenge? Beyond the scale and engineering feats, the fear of Xerxes was fueled by a completely different, deeper source, an understanding of his ultimate goal. Unlike his father Darius, whose campaign in 490 BC could be seen as a punitive expedition directed primarily against Athens and Eretria for their support of the Ionian revolt, Xerxes' intentions were total. He did not go to punish, but to enslave. He did not go for tribute, but for land.
His goal was not simply to incorporate the Greek city-states into the Persian Empire as satrapies. He sought to destroy the very essence of Hellenic identity, their freedom, eleutheria, and independence, autonomia. This was no secret. The Persian envoys who preceded the army demanded earth and water from the Greek cities, an ancient symbol of complete and unconditional submission. This meant renouncing not only political sovereignty, but also the right to the very land on which they lived. For a Greek whose identity was inextricably linked to his polis, to his piece of land, this was tantamount to civil death. Cities that accepted this demand, such as Thebes and many polises in Thessaly, were considered medism and viewed by other Greeks as traitors. But even those who obeyed did so out of sheer terror, knowing that the alternative was complete physical annihilation. Xerxes left no room for negotiation or compromise. His message was simple: either you become my slaves, or you cease to exist. This was not a war for territory, but for a choice of civilization. The Greeks saw Persian rule as despotism, where everyone, except one person, the king, was a slave. Their own society, even in aristocratic or oligarchic city-states, was based on the concept of citizens with rights and responsibilities. Xerxes' threat was to turn free citizens into voiceless subjects, into dust under the feet of the King of Kings. It was this existential threat, a threat to their very way of life, that made the fear of him so pervasive. Xerxes' cruelty was not simply a manifestation of bad temper. It was a deliberate and effective tool of state policy and psychological pressure. His reputation as a ruthless ruler preceded his campaign against Greece. Shortly before that, he had to suppress major uprisings in the richest provinces of his empire, Egypt and Babylon. In Babylon, a city with an ancient history and culture that retained its special status even after the Persian conquest, 2 revolts broke out. Xerxes suppressed them with unprecedented cruelty. He stripped Babylon of its privileges, destroyed its powerful defensive walls, and, most terrifying for the Babylonians, removed the golden statue of their supreme god Marduk from the main temple of Esagila. According to some sources, the statue was melted down. For the ancient world, this was not just an act of sacrilege, but a symbolic murder of a god and the destruction of the soul of the city. Rumors of this spread throughout the oikumene. If the king did this to the great Babylon, what would he do to the small Greek cities? In Egypt, the uprising was suppressed just as harshly. Xerxes appointed his brother Achaemenes a satrap who established a regime of brutal oppression in the country to prevent any possibility of a new rebellion. These examples were known to the Greeks. They understood that they were dealing with a ruler for whom entire peoples and their ancient beliefs were merely obstacles on the path to absolute power. This reputation was confirmed on Greek soil. The story of the beheading of King Leonidas' body after the Battle of Thermopylae was only the most famous, but far from the only episode. Herodotus describes another, equally telling case. When Xerxes' army passed through Thrace, the local tribes living near the Strymon River resisted the Persians. After suppressing them, the Persian magi priests accompanying the army performed a ritual sacrifice. They buried 9 local young men and 9 young women alive as an offering to the underground god. For the Greeks, whose religious practices, even the most bloody ones, had certain limits, such barbaric cruelty was beyond comprehension. These were not just enemies, they were monsters who sacrificed human beings. Even to those who submitted, Xerxes could show sudden and irrational cruelty.
The story of the Lydian rich man Pythias is telling. He warmly welcomed the entire Persian army, fed it, and offered the king all his untold treasures for the war effort. Xerxes, touched by such devotion, not only refused the money, but added his own to it. However, later, when Pythias, frightened by a bad omen, dared to ask the king to release one of his 5 sons from the army as a support in his old age, Xerxes flew into a rage. He saw this humble request as a doubt in his success. The king ordered that son to be found, his body cut in half, and both halves placed on either side of the road, along which the entire Persian army then marched solemnly. This horrific act was a lesson to all. Loyalty to the king must be absolute and unquestioning, and the slightest doubt or personal request is punishable by death with exemplary cruelty. Such stories, passed on by word of mouth, created an image not just of a powerful monarch, but of an unpredictable and ruthless tyrant whose mercy was as dangerous as his wrath. The burning of Athens was the culmination of this campaign of terror. It was not a spontaneous act of vandalism by heated soldiers. It was a deliberate action with deep symbolic meaning. Athens was the heart of the resistance, the main ideological opponent of Persian despotism. By destroying the city, Xerxes destroyed the symbol of Greek freedom. The Persian army entered a city abandoned by most of its population, who had evacuated to the island of Salamis. However, a small group of defenders took refuge on the Acropolis, the sacred hill. Priests, temple servants, and a few desperate citizens who interpreted the prophecy of the Delphic oracle about wooden walls literally and fortified the approaches to the temples with a wooden palisade. The Persians climbed the steep cliffs, killed all the defenders, and set fire to all the shrines of the Acropolis. The ancient temple of Athena Pallas, the Hecatompedon, and other structures that had been the center of religious life for the Athenians for centuries were reduced to ashes. For the Greeks, this was not just the destruction of buildings. It was the desecration of the most sacred place, the home of the patron gods. The smoke rising above the Acropolis was visible from Salamis, where the Greek fleet and Athenian refugees were located. This sight was intended to break their spirit, to show that their gods were powerless to protect them from the might of the Persian king. Xerxes was avenging the burning of the Persian city of Sardis by the Athenians during the Ionian revolt, and his revenge was demonstratively disproportionate. He did not simply burn the city, he tried to erase its soul. This act of barbarism, however, had the opposite effect. It united the Greeks, filling their hearts not only with fear, but also with rage and a thirst for revenge. The sight of the smoking ruins of their shrines turned the war for survival into a holy war. Xerxes' personal presence on the theater of war was another factor that intensified the fear.
He was not an abstract ruler from distant Susa, but a living, visible embodiment of the threat. His golden throne, set on the slope of Mount Egaleo overlooking the strait where the Battle of Salamis was taking place, became a classic image. He sat there not merely as a spectator, but as a judge, ready to reward those who distinguished themselves and punish those who had failed. Scribes beside him recorded every episode of the battle, noting the valor or cowardice of his captains. This created incredible psychological pressure. The Greeks saw that they were fighting not just a faceless army, but the will of one man who was watching their every move. His presence turned the battle into a personal confrontation. Every Greek sailor, rowing his trireme, knew that there, on the shore, sat the man who had ordered their homes to be burned and their temples desecrated. This personified the enemy, making him even more hateful and terrifying. Xerxes' confidence in his victory was almost absolute. He believed that the outcome of the battle was a foregone conclusion due to the overwhelming numerical superiority of his fleet. This self-confidence, or hubris, was evident in everything he did. He had no doubt that he would witness the triumphant defeat of the last forces of Greek resistance. His defeat at Salamis was not just a tactical failure for him, but a profound personal humiliation that unfolded before his very eyes. Herodotus describes how the king leapt from his throne in rage when he saw his ships being destroyed. The fear that he had instilled in others for so long may have touched him for the first time at that moment. Finally, the fear of Xerxes was a fear of the alien, incomprehensible world that he represented. For the Greeks, with their cult of reason, moderation, and harmony, the Persian king was the embodiment of Asian despotism, irrational and boundless. His title, King of Kings, King of Countries, already sounded monstrous to Greek ears. In their world, each polis was a separate state, and the idea of one man ruling the entire known world seemed unnatural. The practice of proskynesis, prostrating oneself before the king, mandatory at the Persian court, was a symbol of slavery for the Greeks. A free Hellen could only prostrate himself before the gods. The requirement to perform this ritual before a mortal man, even a powerful one, was perceived as blasphemy and the greatest humiliation. Xerxes brought with him not just an army, but a civilization built on completely different principles. It was a civilization where the will of one man was law, where luxury was boundless and cruelty was an everyday tool of power. The Greeks feared not only losing their independence, they feared dissolving into this alien world, losing their identity, becoming nameless slaves in a vast empire where their cities would become mere dots on a map, obliged to pay tribute and supply recruits. Thus, the fear of Xerxes was multi-layered. It was a fear of physical destruction, a fear of losing freedom, a fear of desecration of shrines, and finally, a deep metaphysical fear of the absorption of their bright, rational world by irrational and immeasurable Eastern despotism. Thus, the fear of Xerxes was multi-layered. In addition to the obvious physical threat, Xerxes carried with him something more subtle but no less frightening to the Greek consciousness: ideological warfare. The Greeks, especially the Athenians, were in the process of a great social experiment, the establishment of democracy. Their world was built on the concepts of isonomy, equality of all citizens before the law, and parrhesia, the right to speak freely at public assemblies. These were revolutionary ideas, fragile and not yet fully established. Xerxes' invasion was a direct threat to this experiment. He brought with him the absolute opposite, a world where the law was the will of one man, and only those whom the king allowed to speak had the right to vote. The fear was that the Persian model was seductive in its own way. It offered stability, order, and an end to the endless internecine wars of the Greek city-states. For many Greek aristocrats, whose power was being eroded by the growing influence of the demos, the prospect of becoming viceroys of a powerful king, relying on his strength to suppress their fellow citizens, was very attractive. This internal division, the threat of betrayal from within, was no less frightening than an external army. Xerxes was not simply going to conquer lands. He carried with him the virus of autocracy, which could infect and destroy Greek society from within. Themistocles, the Athenian leader, understood this threat perfectly well.
The logistical nightmare of supplying Xerxes' army was in itself a weapon of intimidation. The Greeks were seafarers and traders. They understood perfectly well how much grain, wine, olive oil, and water were needed to sustain even a small city. Now imagine that this city was nomadic, and its population was dozens of times larger than that of the largest Greek city-states. Herodotus gives a telling anecdote. When the inhabitants of the island of Phasos, famous for its wealth, learned that they would have to receive and feed the Persian army for one day, they spent 400 talents of silver on it, a colossal sum, enough to cover the annual budget of an entire state. After the Persians left, according to the historian, the people of Phasos could safely leave their homes without locking their doors, because there was nothing left in them worth stealing. This story, albeit embellished, reflects a real problem. Xerxes' army moved like locusts, devouring everything in its path. For the Greek communities living on fertile but limited land, this meant inevitable starvation, even if the Persians did not cause them direct harm. The very fact that the army was passing through their territory was tantamount to ruin. The fear was not only of the sword, but also of the starvation that would follow the departure of this insatiable Leviathan. Moreover, the Greeks realized that such a huge army could not remain in one place for long. It had to constantly move forward in search of new sources of sustenance. This gave the invasion the character of an inexorable natural cataclysm that could not be stopped or waited out. It would move until it had consumed everything. Xerxes used the multinational composition of his army as another tool of psychological pressure. It was not just an army, but a living ethnographic map of his empire, a parade of conquered peoples. The Greeks, standing on the walls of their cities, saw not the familiar enemy hoplite, but a kaleidoscope of exotic and frightening warriors. Medes and Kissians in felt hats, Assyrians in bronze helmets of bizarre shapes, Bactrians with reed bows, Scythians in pointed caps, armed with battle axes called sagaris. The contingents from the edges of the empire made a particularly strong impression. Libyans in leather clothes, armed with spears burned in fire, and Ethiopians from beyond the Nile, whose bodies were painted half with chalk and half with cinnabar, dressed in leopard and lion skins, with bows made of palm branches and arrows with stone tips. This was not just an army. It was a demonstration of the boundless power of a king capable of gathering people from all corners of the world under his banner. For a Greek, whose world was often limited to neighboring valleys and islands, this sight was staggering. It visualized the concept of the barbarian world, vast, incomprehensible, and hostile, united only by the will of a single despot. It undermined the very belief in the possibility of resistance. How could one defeat an enemy who could replace every fallen warrior with 10 new ones, brought from lands the Greeks did not even know existed? Furthermore, the battle tactics of these peoples were completely foreign to classical phalanx warfare. The Greeks were accustomed to decisive battles between heavily armed infantrymen on flat terrain. The Persian army, on the other hand, relied on cavalry, archers, and light infantry, preferring to wear down the enemy from a distance, showering them with a hail of arrows before engaging in close combat. The famous response of the Spartan Dienechus before the Battle of Thermopylae, that "this is excellent news, since the Medes will block out the sun with their arrows, meaning we will fight in the shade," is an example of heroic contempt for a tactic that inspired panic and terror in most people. The fear of Persian arrows was so great that it became a household name. It was the fear of an impersonal death coming from afar, without a chance to look the enemy in the eye and show personal valor. Persian propaganda, which skillfully used religious motifs, also played an important role in shaping the image of Xerxes. The Achaemenid king was not just a secular ruler, he was the chosen one of the supreme god Ahura Mazda, his representative on earth, entrusted with establishing order, arta, and punishing those who sowed lies, druga. From the point of view of Persian ideology, the Greeks who refused to submit were not simply enemies, but bearers of lies, violators of the divine world order. The invasion was thus presented not as an act of aggression, but as a sacred mission, a restoration of justice. This ideological background gave Xerxes' actions a touch of fanatical conviction. He had no doubt about his right to rule the world. This was evident in his correspondence and decrees, where he spoke not as an equal among equals, but as a master addressing his unreasonable slaves. When he offered the Greeks surrender, it was not an offer of peace, but a grant of mercy. Refusal was seen not as an act of valor, but as ingratitude and rebellion, deserving of the most severe punishment. For the Greeks, whose gods were anthropomorphic, often argued among themselves and did not always side with their worshippers, such monolithic confidence in divine support was alien and frightening. They saw before them a man who sincerely believed that the cosmos itself was on his side. This turned the war into a metaphysical confrontation. The Greeks fought not only for their homes and freedom, but also for their Olympian gods against a foreign almighty deity and his earthly representative. Fear of Xerxes was, in a sense, fear of his god. The Persian intelligence and diplomacy system, which had been operating long before the arrival of the main army, was particularly terrifying.
Xerxes did not simply lead an army. He actively divided the Greek world from within, using bribery, blackmail, and promises. He was well aware of the internal contradictions between the city-states, of the enmity between Athens and Aegina, Sparta and Argos. His envoys and agents worked with the oracles, especially the Delphic oracle, trying to obtain prophecies favorable to the Persians. Ambiguous predictions, such as advising the Athenians to seek refuge behind wooden walls, sowed panic and discord. This soft power created an atmosphere of total mistrust. No one could be sure of their neighbor. A city that today swore to fight to the end could tomorrow join the Medes, opening the way for the enemy to strike from behind. Argos, one of the largest city-states in the Peloponnese, declared its neutrality, effectively paralyzing the considerable forces of the Spartans, who were forced to fear a blow from behind. In Thebes and other cities of Boeotia, aristocratic circles openly sympathized with the Persians, seeing in them a force capable of crushing their democratically minded opponents. Thus, the fear of Xerxes was also a fear of betrayal. It was a war where the front line ran not only through mountain passes, but also within city walls, in the agora, and in the hearts of the citizens themselves. The threat was not only external, but also internal. The Greeks feared not only the Persian soldiers, but also their own compatriots, who could turn out to be a fifth column. This feeling of widespread betrayal, fueled by Persian diplomacy, undermined the very possibility of united resistance and greatly increased the sense of hopelessness. Finally, the personality of Xerxes himself, as perceived by the Greeks, was a source of irrational terror. He was the product of a completely different culture of upbringing. The heir to the Persian throne grew up in an atmosphere of absolute adoration and unquestioning obedience. From childhood, his will was law for everyone around him. This shaped a character that did not know the word no, was incapable of compromise, and perceived any obstacle as a personal insult. His anger was not just an emotion, but a destructive force of nature. The story of Pythias, who cut down his own son, is not just an example of cruelty, but an example of the psychology of an absolute monarch. Phidias's request was perceived not as a father's plea, but as a violation of the established order, where all the sons of all subjects belonged to the king. Xerxes' rage was caused not so much by the content of the request as by the very fact of its existence. In his world, a subject could not ask, he could only obey. The Greeks, with their culture of dialogue, debate in the agora, and court proceedings, were confronted with a man for whom dialogue was impossible in principle. It was impossible to negotiate with him or to persuade him. One could either submit or die. This absolute irrational will, unrestricted by laws, traditions, or even, the fear was that the Persian model was seductive in its own way. It offered stability, order, and an end to the endless internecine wars of the Greek city-states. For many Greek aristocrats, whose power was being eroded by the growing influence of the demos, the prospect of becoming viceroys of a powerful king, relying on his strength to suppress their fellow citizens, was very attractive. This internal division, the threat of betrayal from within, was no less frightening than the external army. Xerxes was not simply going to conquer lands. He carried with him the virus of autocracy, which could infect and destroy Greek society from within. Themistocles, the Athenian leader, understood this threat perfectly well. That is why he fought so desperately for the unification of the Greeks, knowing that if they could not oppose the Persian monarchy with a united front of free citizens, their civilizational project would be doomed.
Another aspect that heightened the fear was the memory of the fate of the Ionian Greeks. After suppressing their uprising a generation before Xerxes' campaign, the Persians brutally dealt with the rebels. The most flourishing city of Ionia, Miletus, was wiped off the face of the earth, its men killed, and its women and children taken into slavery deep into Asia. This tragedy was not an abstract story, but a living wound in the memory of the Hellenic world. The Greeks in the Balkans understood perfectly well that Xerxes was coming to finish what his father had started in Ionia. The fate of Miletus was a vivid example of what awaited them in case of defeat. This turned the war into a fight to the death, where capture was not considered a real alternative. In addition, the Persian fleet, consisting mainly of ships from conquered seafaring peoples, the Phoenicians, Cypriots, and Egyptians, posed a particular threat. The Greeks were accustomed to considering themselves the masters of the Aegean Sea. Now they were confronted by the best sailors of the eastern Mediterranean, united under a single command and outnumbering them. It was a challenge to the very foundation of their power. The fear of Xerxes was not just a reaction to his large army, but a consequence of his unyielding will, cruelty, and willingness to challenge the very foundations of the world. His legacy reminds us that the threat comes not only from power, but also from a personality capable of combining scale, engineering genius, and ruthlessness into a single front of intimidation. That's all for now. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you next time.